Perez-Alonso third-place clash was legendary, so why is he still getting stick for it? From my point of view, this was the kind of weekend that Sergio Perez needed. Collect a huge amount of points in the battle for second place in the driver's standings. He was able to capitalize on quite a lot the W14's hardship and Lewis Hamilton going down the order. At one point, he was asking to be put on the hard tyres, which have probably made a situation where she might have not even ended up with any points at all. Ooh, seriously, the W14 this weekend was slower than the W13 last year by nearly half a second, according to F-Data analysis. He scored 12 points more than Hamilton did, making his advantage over Lewis 32 points. That is pretty conclusive. All Checo needs to do now is have 2 crashless weekends and make sure Hamilton doesn't score 6 points more than him in Vegas, thanks to the fact that on countback, Checo has 2 wins, whereas Lewis has none. If Lewis doesn't score or DNFs in Vegas, it's all over. As far as I see it, this has been the best weekend for Checo since the Italian Grand Prix. I don't think Checo really did anything wrong from his point of view. He's done everything he can to get the best result possible. Because in qualifying, he was out of position. He had poor track positioning as soon as the storms and winds came in. All Checo had to do was not screw up. He just had to get points and rebuild his confidence again after the drubbing he has had from Max Verstappen completely wailing against him in Miami and Helmut Marko completely derailing him throughout the entire season. This was a fantastic weekend for Perez. So why am I seeing comments that this is the weekend that really should see him being replaced with Daniel Ricciardo? What? Why? Why is he being dubbed a loser? Why am I seeing comments of like, oh yeah, Checo did have a really good weekend. He still should have beat Alonso. He was in a slower car. Was he though? There are stats saying that it was a lot closer than you think. The race and Peter Windsor being 2 examples that come to mind. By the way, there's no beef between any of those 2 organizations. I am politely and respectfully disagreeing with their viewpoints, which is what a discussion and debate is all about, folks. You don't have to agree with everything that people say. You can just state your case and go like, I'm not really sure about that from my perspective. Okay. Max Verstappen finished ahead of Sergio Perez by 34 seconds. That is quite a big gap. But when you look at the stats, Checo was the 3rd fastest car on average throughout the entire race. And he had to do a lot more overtaking than Max did. If you start in the middle of an F1 field, around the mid-pack or even at the back, you are going to lose a lot more time than you would if you were near the front of the pack. For example, you were 17th. By the time you get to maybe lap 15 or something, you're a pit stop down behind the guy in the lead. That's just what happens. That's just what you can expect. So Perez, starting 9th through no fault of his own, had to then make up positions and start overtaking people, whereas Max and Lando, they were at the front. They didn't have to do anything. Lando did make a statement by getting the fastest lap, which was something, and as a really clear indicator that maybe on this day, supporting Checo, why he had a good weekend, McLaren were probably the ones with the fastest car throughout the entire weekend. Max is what made the difference in making Red Bull come out on top. For Checo, after his bruisingly horrific Turn 1 attempt at Mexico to make the most audacious overtaking move in recent history, he just had to have a quiet weekend, keep his head down, and try and extend the gap to Lewis, which is exactly what he did. He did the best he could after Red Bull got his track positioning in Q3 completely wrong. He was one of the last people out there, and as we saw with Oscar Piastri, he was put out last, which was a major mistake for McLaren because Oscar Piastri was a victim of the unexpected winds around Junchal, and therefore he fell off the track. He didn't even get a time in, and Checo was not much better, getting the 9th fastest time. Had he been sent out a little bit earlier, along with the other front runners, he might have had a better grid position, maybe being faster than the Astons, or maybe splitting the Astons. He would have been a lot closer. I think a fairer comparison between he and Max, what you could have expected, is in the sprint shootout. In normal conditions, where you don't have to worry about wind and rain too much, Checo was less than a 10th behind Verstappen. That is much more like it. This weekend, I think this is a good example of why Perez needs to stay at Red Bull for 2024. He was able to have such a bombastic battle with one of the greatest drivers of all time, and keep it clean, keep it respectful, and not do anything down there or desperate. So, according to Peter Windsor's comments, that was enough to tell Red Bull, yeah, you should chuck him. And he had been really defending of Perez's situation throughout the entire season, but this was the flashpoint. His little mistake was enough to go like, yeah, no, just bin him. Again, I am respectfully disagreeing with Mr. Windsor's viewpoint. No beef. Absolutely no beef. I really don't think this is the kind of performance to indicate to Christian Horner and Helmut Marko that, yeah, no, Perez is washed, get rid of him, put Daniel in. This is not something they really should be taking seriously. And yes, of course, Daniel had a really good performance making the most of his situation a lap down. He was lapping as quickly as the leaders, which makes you think what might have been had he been able to stay on the same lap. But I think you'll find that Red Bull had no issue with Perez's performance this weekend. In fact, Marko has been the most glowing at Perez that he has been in a long time. He only had one little minor thing to say about his little squirrely situation in turn 2, compromising his exit out of turn 3, which meant that Alonso could get back past him, because Checo did get past Alonso. Again, the stats show that he was only slightly faster than Alonso in a reset Aston Martin car, and he was able to do it and keep close, so it really wasn't that much of a big issue. Marko thought his performance was absolutely unbelievable, exactly what he needed after his really bad time in Mexico. So if you're getting that much praise from the Austrian doctor, who's been on your case the entire season, take it. This is a good sign you are doing what they are expecting of you. You are keeping the gap to Lewis very, very wide, over 30 points now, with 2 races to go. I think it's a lot safer than it was back in Austin that, yeah, you're going to be giving something that Red Bull has never had in its entire time as a constructor. They have never been able to do the 1-2 and constructors, the clean sweep. So yeah, I think he had a really good time with it. So calling him a loser? No, absolutely not. And then there's another factor that you have to take into consideration here. You have to remember who Perez was fighting against. It was not Lance Stroll. If it were Lance Stroll, then there might have been a bit of a problem. But Perez was fighting one of the greatest drivers of all time not to have won many more championships, Fernando Alonso. People have been keen to note that Aston Martin have been washed lately, that, the beginning of the season was a fluke, but this weekend proved that the team still does have what it takes to be good. When they were able to reset their upgrades and recalibrate themselves with a hybrid floor solution, they were able to be right back on it as one of the best cars on the grid. Both cars had pace, not just Alonso. Stroll had the pace too. And you have to be giving credit where credit is due, folks. You may not like Lance Stroll, but when he does well, you have to give him his dues. And also, it made me realize something, why their upgrades went so awry. You gotta remember here, folks, Aston Martin is still in a place of transition. They are still in the process of upgrading their equipment from the stuff that's been relatively outdated and part of their young, plucky underdog situation, which originated from Jordan, into the big, hyper-futuristic, really sophisticated wind tunnel technology that will be able to give them even better performance in the data streams that they have in the new computer systems. That's slowly coming online. When that does come online, like the McLaren wind tunnel has been doing so this year, they will be able to get much better information out of the parts that they want to bring to the car. The disparity between the computer simulations and the actual track data will be a lot closer, so you will not likely see this complete disconnect of upgrades being downgrades. This is all part of the process of Aston Martin becoming a bigger team. How can you tell that this upgrade reset has worked? Well, Lance Stroll was 1.3 seconds quicker than he was last year. That's quite a lot. Once again, Alonso was just as quick as Checo. If on average Alonso was, say, 2, 3, 4 tenths slower than Checo, then you might be able to think, maybe Checo should have gotten past him a little bit sooner. No. As far as I could see, Alonso had equal machinery to Sergio Perez in terms of lap times and performance. That meant that Alonso had to dig deep and use every single trick in his book to keep Perez behind him, to use different lines, expertly by the way, intimidation, every single thing he could muster to make sure that by the time the checkered flag waved, he was the one ahead of Checo. I will be using examples from Schumacher, Alonso, 2005 Imola. It's been done to death, but there are some really interesting parallels here. Alonso had to resort to placing his car in areas where Michael could not overtake. Because remember, Imola is a place where you really cannot overtake, even back in the day when the cars were a lot smaller than they are today. That meant that Michael had to resort to using unorthodox lines, unusual lines into corners, which could in theory throw off Alonso in going, why is he doing that? Maybe putting Alonso into a mistake, and that means Michael could go past, which never happened. Alonso is a lot steelier than that. I feel like Alonso remembered that tactic from Michael and used it against Perez. Going on different lines, unorthodox means of getting into corners, getting different traction, which might have thrown off Perez, and therefore kept the gap just about enough, so that means Perez couldn't get him on the straight all the time. There was just about 8 tenths coming out of Junchal. That was really, really wily, Fernando, using that moment to really be to his own benefit when Michael was trying to get past him in Imola. That was fascinating. And yes, of course, Checo did get past him eventually, and then the turn 2, turn 3 mistake he did have allowed Alonso to get DRS, but if DRS hadn't existed like it was in 2005, then Checo might have done it. DRS is very powerful in Brazil. But you know what? Checo should not be ashamed for losing this battle. He was going up against one of the best drivers in Formula 1 history. He deserves way more titles than he actually has. And he had to resort to every single thing in his arsenal to get past Perez. This was not an easy battle. And in turn, Checo did not resort to any dirty tricks, desperation tactics like late braking and potentially colliding with Alonso. They did not once touch. That is really impressive and reminds people that Sergio Perez does not suck. That's why he deserved that hug he got from Fernando after the race. Having this lesson in hard racing going into 2024 will be vital for Sergio Perez's future in Formula 1. I still think that Checo's best solution for 2024 is to not go after Max. Do not even try and go for the world title, because you're not going to win it. Max Verstappen is determined, and he is now looking in the mirrors for Lando Norris. What Checo must do is try and get the 1-2 again for Red Bull, get the constructors, be the perfect number 2. Nobody is really expecting Sergio Perez to beat Max Verstappen. That is not going to happen. Verstappen is in his prime, whereas Checo is going into the twilight years of his career. If he can just do the deed, get a couple of wins every now and again when Max falters, get some consistent points, being in the top 5 on the regular, and making sure that Red Bull win the constructors easily, second place isn't even an issue, that'll be a really big boost for his resume. Come the time his contract ends, he decides to leave Red Bull on good terms, he will be a very interesting candidate for any sort of team. He will be putting himself in a prime position to maybe go back to the Sauber Audi operation and partnering Nico Hülkenberg. Those two drivers together, returning to the days of Force India, that could be really mighty for that team because they'll have a lot of experience with a top team such as Red Bull, and Perez might be able to have the opportunity of leading that team or being on equal footing with Nico. 2024 could be really good, and this lesson, battling Alonso, which is going to go down in the history books, certainly the recent history books, as one of the best battles that we have seen in Formula 1. A great example for newbies that this is how exciting Formula 1 can get. This is really, really good for Sergio Perez's future. And I'm glad that fans could see this unfold in real time. And if you missed out something else that was unfolding last week, you might want to watch this video next. All of this stuff really got under Fernando's skin about how there could be consequences, but what were they exactly?